Sean and Laura sat across from each other at the dining table, enjoying the easy rhythm of their Friday night. The week had been long, but they managed to find these small moments to reconnect. Laura leaned back in her chair, swirling the last bit of wine in her glass. "You know," she started, "I've been thinking. The girls have been talking about a night out. It's been ages since we've all gone out together. What do you think?" Sean looked up from his plate, catching the excitement in her eyes. "Sounds like a great idea," he said, smiling. "You've been working non-stop lately. You deserve a break." She grinned, her energy shifting from tired to animated in an instant. "That's exactly what I thought. A little fun, some dancing, just the girls." Sean nodded, more focused on finishing his dinner than the conversation at hand. He trusted her, of course, after all, they'd been together for 8 years. They had built a life together, filled with laughter, shared dreams, and what he valued most was unwavering loyalty. The night went by quietly after their conversation. Laura packed her small purse and left around 9 p.m., wearing a sleek dress that she assured him was not too flashy but definitely enough to stand out in a crowded bar. "Don't wait up," she called out as she closed the door behind her. Sean didn't think much of it. He poured himself a beer, sat down to watch a late-night game, and found himself dozing off on the couch before halftime. The house was quiet without Laura's usual bustling energy, but he didn't mind the solitude. The game had long since ended when Sean woke up to the buzz of his phone. Squinting at the screen, he saw a text from Laura, having a blast. "We'll be home late. Don't wait up, love you." He glanced at the time. It was well past midnight, close to 2 a.m. He rubbed his eyes and stretched his legs, shaking off the grogginess. "All right, babe, have fun," he muttered to himself as he typed back a quick response. By the time Laura finally came home, it was close to dawn. Sean only vaguely registered the sound of the front door clicking shut as she tiptoed through the house, trying not to wake him. The soft padding of her feet on the stairs faded as he drifted back into sleep. The next morning, Sean woke early. Laura was still in bed, buried under the covers, her hair messy and her breathing slow. He quietly slipped out of the bedroom, heading for the kitchen to make coffee. The sun was creeping into the sky, and the streets were still, save for the occasional car passing by. It was peaceful, the way he liked his Saturday mornings. After pouring himself a cup, Sean decided to take a look at the car. He grabbed the keys and walked outside, hoping to get the usual weekend errands done early. When he opened the door to the back seat, something caught his eye immediately, a small piece of fabric crumpled in the corner. It looked like part of a shirt or maybe a dress, and it was torn. As he reached for it, his fingers grazed something wet and sticky. He pulled his hand back instinctively, the sharp smell of something pungent hitting his nose. "What the hell?" Sean muttered, holding the fabric between his fingers. He looked closer. The cloth was stained with something white, smeared across its surface, mixed with dirt and grime from the floor of the car. A queasy feeling churned in his stomach. It didn't make sense. Laura had been out with the girls, right? This could have been from anything. Maybe they spilled a drink, maybe someone had a wardrobe malfunction. But as he looked at the torn fabric and inhaled the bitter, almost metallic scent, his gut told him something else. He held the cloth up to the light, squinting at the stain, hoping for some sort of explanation to jump out at him. But the longer he stared at it, the worse the feeling grew. His mind raced through possibilities, each more uncomfortable than the last. Maybe it's nothing, he thought. Maybe it's something innocent, something explainable. But the sticky residue on the cloth, the smell, none of it felt innocent. His hand shook as he folded the fabric up and shoved it into his pocket. He needed to ask Laura about it, but something in him hesitated. What would he even say? How would she react? Was he overreacting? Sean shook his head, clearing his thoughts, and walked back into the house. He could hear Laura stirring upstairs, her footsteps slow and heavy as she padded toward the bathroom. He stood by the kitchen window, gripping the cloth in his hand, replaying the moment he found it over and over in his mind. The possibilities nodded at him, each one worse than the last. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but this wasn't normal. Something was off. Laura eventually came down, dressed in her usual weekend clothes, jeans and an oversized sweatshirt, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. She smiled at him, her eyes tired but happy, like nothing was out of the ordinary. "Good morning, babe," she yawned, leaning in to give him a peck on the cheek. "What are you up to?" Sean forced a smile, his mind still racing. "Just checking in the car." "How was your night?" Laura's face lit up as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "It was great. We went to a couple of bars, did some dancing, just the usual. It was good to see the girls." He watched her closely, waiting for any sign of hesitation or guilt, but she seemed perfectly at ease, completely unaware of the non-suspicion that was now growing in Sean's chest. As she sat down to breakfast, Sean's eyes drifted back to the torn cloth in his pocket. He could feel its weight, like a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. "Anything strange happened last night?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Laura raised an eyebrow but didn't miss a beat. "No, not really. Just the usual bar scene." She shrugged, fighting the urge to pull out the cloth and demand an explanation right then and there. "No reason," he muttered, his mind spinning with doubt as the day wore on. Sean couldn't shake the unease, he needed to know for sure. Days passed, but the unease inside Sean only deepened. The torn piece of cloth had become an obsession. He couldn't forget the smell, the texture, the sticky substance that clung to his fingers when he first touched it. Every time he looked at Laura, a nagging doubt crept into his mind, tainting every conversation, every moment of their routine life. She seemed the same, still laughing at their favorite TV shows, still kissing him on the cheek before heading out to run errands, but Sean wasn't. He found himself staring at her when she wasn't looking, studying her for signs, hints, anything that would make sense of the nagging feeling gnawing at his insides. After a sleepless night, Sean made a decision. He wasn't the type to make wild accusations. He needed proof, something concrete to justify the question whirling in his head. Early one morning, before Laura woke, he slipped out of bed, grabbed the torn piece of fabric from where he had stashed it, and headed out to find answers. Sean found a discreet lab in the next town over that offered testing services. The place was small, tucked away in a strip mall between a pharmacy and a dry cleaner's. It looked unassuming, but he figured it was better than nothing. He walked in, glancing nervously over his shoulder as though someone might recognize him. The woman at the counter barely looked up from her magazine as Sean handed her the envelope containing the cloth. She took it, marked it with a label, and told him the results would be ready in a few days, no questions asked. The waiting felt endless. Every day dragged as Sean went through the motions of normal life, while his mind spiraled into paranoia. His mind raced with possibilities, but he tried to keep it together for Laura's sake. He still wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation for it all, that maybe it was nothing, but the truth lingered, waiting to reveal itself. Then the call came. Sean was in the kitchen making coffee when his phone buzzed on the counter. He grabbed it, seeing the unknown number flash across the screen. His heart pounded. He had almost forgotten about the lab, had almost convinced himself that there was nothing to worry about, but as he answered, he felt the weight of the moment. "Mr. Sean," the voice on the other end said, sounding professional and detached. "Yes, this is Sean," he replied, his voice thick with tension. "This is Dr. Taylor from the lab. We've completed the analysis of the sample you provided." Sean swallowed hard, and there was a brief pause on the other end, the kind of pause that made Sean feel like the ground was slipping beneath him. "I'm afraid the results are troubling," Dr. Taylor said carefully. "We found multiple DNA profiles on the fabric you submitted." "Multiple," Sean repeated, his brain struggling to catch up. "Yes, multiple." The technician confirmed there were samples from at least 9 different individuals, and well, that's not all. There were traces of a fatal sexually transmitted disease in the sample. Sean's mind went blank for a moment. He stared at the coffee pot, the slow drip of liquid filling the carafe, but it felt distant, irrelevant. His grip tightened on the phone. "A fatal STD?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Dr. Taylor replied, sounding more hesitant now. "I'm sorry, but that's what the results show. The strain is rare but aggressive. It's highly dangerous." Sean's stomach churned, his hands began to tremble, and he gripped the edge of the counter for support. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice cracking. "This can't be right. There has to be a mistake." "The results are clear, Mr. Sean," Dr. Taylor said, his tone firm but sympathetic. "I understand this must be hard to take in, but I assure you, the tests are accurate." Sean didn't know what to say, his head was spinning. He muttered a quiet thanks before hanging up, but the phone felt like dead weight in his hand. He stood frozen in the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee now nauseating. He set the phone down on the counter, the words multiple DNA profiles and fatal SD looping endlessly in his mind. For a moment, Sean thought he might collapse. His entire work world had shifted in the span of a phone call. He could hear Laura upstairs humming softly as she got ready for the day. The sound made his skin crawl. The woman he loved, the woman he thought he knew, could she have done this? Could she really have put their lives, their future, at such risk? Sean closed his eyes, gripping the counter tighter. He had to think. At first, his instinct was to protect her. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding, maybe Laura didn't know, maybe she had been manipulated, coerced into something she couldn't control. He wanted to believe that, wanted to cling to the idea that the woman he married couldn't betray him like this. But the evidence was too strong, the torn cloth, the multiple DNA profiles, the disease. This wasn't an accident. Something had happened, something awful, and he needed to confront it. But how? He couldn't just ask Laura outright if she was lying about this. She'd lie about anything. He needed more. He needed to know the full story before he could even think about talking to her. That's when it hit him, a private investigator. It was drastic, but Sean felt he had no choice. If Laura was hiding something, if she was involved with someone else, or worse, multiple people, he needed to know for sure. The thought of someone else touching her, of her being with other men, made his blood boil. He had to find the truth, no matter how much it hurt. That evening, Sean made a few calls, and by the next day, he had hired a reputable investigator. The man on the phone had sounded no-nonsense, assuring Sean that he'd get to the bottom of it. He promised results within a week. Sean hung up the phone and sat in silence. The investigation was now out of his hands. All he could do was wait again, but this time, the waiting was different. It was filled with dread, anticipation, and a growing realization that everything he thought he knew about his life with Laura might soon come crashing down. He lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling as Laura slept beside him. Her breathing was soft and steady, like nothing was wrong in her world, but for Sean, sleep was impossible. His mind was a storm of questions, doubts, and images of what might come next. As the days dragged on, Sean's heart felt heavier. He avoided Laura as much as he could without raising suspicion. Each time she kissed him or smiled at him, it felt like a lie, but he kept up the charade, waiting for the day when the investigator would call, when the truth would finally be laid bare. And deep down, Sean knew that whatever that truth was, nothing would ever be the same again. Sean sat at his desk, staring at the computer screen. The email from the private investigator had arrived earlier that morning. His heart pounded as he hovered over the file, his finger trembling just above the trackpad. He had waited for days, agonizing over what the investigator might find. Now the moment had come, and Sean wasn't sure if he was ready. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to calm the storm inside his chest. What if this was all just a misunderstanding? What if there was some logical explanation for everything? The lab results had been damning, but he had held on to a sliver of hope, hoping that somehow, someway, this was all a mistake. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him back to reality. It was the private investigator calling. Sean answered with a shaky breath, "Hello." The investigator's voice was calm, but there was a heaviness in his tone. "Mr. Sean, I have something you need to see. I'm sorry in advance for what you're about to witness." Sean's stomach dropped. The man's words hit him like a punch in the gut. There was no escaping it now. Whatever he was about to see would change his life forever. "I understand," Sean replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The investigator sighed on the other end of the line. "I sent the files to your email. Watch it when you're ready. Take care of yourself, Mr. Sean." Sean muttered a quick thank you before hanging up. His hands were sweating now. He wiped them on his jeans and forced himself to click the file. The screen went black for a moment, and then the video began to play. At first, the camera was shaky, the footage grainy in the dim light of the backyard. The scene was quiet, except for the faint sound of water splashing. Sean recognized the location instantly, the backyard of a house he didn't know, but one that had hosted a party. His eyes followed the camera's movements as it zoomed in on a large pool surrounded by a group of people. Then he saw her, Laura. Sean's chest tightened as she came into focus, laughing and wading in the water. She was wearing nothing but a smile. Surrounding her were 12 men, naked, faceless figures to Sean, but their presence was overwhelming. His throat tightened as he watched her interact with them, the carefree way she moved through the water, completely unaware that she was being recorded. The camera zoomed in on Laura's face, capturing the joy in her eyes, the uninhibited laughter spilling from her lips. For a split second, Sean hoped it would stop there, that maybe this was just a joke, a cruel prank. But then the laughter grew louder, more raucous, and the men closed in on her, their bodies pressing against hers. Sean's stomach turned as the scene unfolded before him, each second more excruciating than the last. He clenched his fists as the camera panned around the pool, showing the men's hands on her, their bodies intertwining with hers in ways that made his skin crawl. It wasn't just the physical betrayal that cut him, it was the look on her face, the joy, the pleasure. She wasn't just participating, she was reveling in it. Sean's breathing became shallow, his pulse pounding in his ears. His mind screamed for him to turn it off, to stop watching, but he couldn't. He was glued to the screen, trapped in a nightmare unfolding before him. "No, Laura, how could you?" he whispered to himself, his voice cracking. The video continued, showing them laughing, drinking, and engaging in acts Sean could never have imagined in his worst nightmares. The once familiar sound of Laura's laughter now cut through him like a knife. It was the same laugh she used when they watched movies together, the same laugh that once brought him joy. Now, it was poison. The screen finally faded to black, but the damage was done. Sean sat frozen, his hands still gripping the armrest of his chair as if the room were spinning around him. His mind went blank, unable to process what he had just witnessed. For what felt like hours, he didn't move. His eyes were glued to the dark screen, his heart a shattered mess in his chest. The love he had once felt for Laura, the love that had defined so much of his life, crumbled into dust in that moment. There was no coming back from this. No apology, no explanation could ever repair the damage. He replayed the final moments of the video in his head, the way she had smiled, the way she had let those men touch her, with no regard for the life they had built together, the life he thought they had. Sean finally let out a breath, but it was shallow and shaky. He stood up, feeling lightheaded, and stumbled toward the window. The sunlight poured in through the glass, but it felt wrong, out of place in the darkness of his thoughts. He gripped the windowsill, his knuckles white, his mind raced. How long had this been going on? Was this the first time, or had there been other nights, other girls' nights out that had ended in the same betrayal? A wave of anger surged through him, hot and blinding. He slammed his fist into the wall beside the window, the dull thud echoing through the room. The pain in his hand was nothing compared to the pain in his chest. He wanted to scream, to tear the house apart, but instead, he just stood there, breathing heavily, trying to contain the rage bubbling inside him. The sound of Laura's car pulling into the driveway jolted him back to reality. She was home. Sean wiped the sweat from his brow and forced himself to breathe. He couldn't confront her, not yet, not like this. He needed to be calm, to think clearly. His next move had to be precise, calculated. She couldn't know that he had seen the video, not until he was ready. Laura walked through the front door, her keys jingling as she tossed them onto the table by the entrance. She smiled when she saw Sean standing in the living room, oblivious to the storm raging inside him. "Hey, babe," she said, her voice gentle. "How was your day?" Sean forced a smile, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. "It was fine," he replied, his voice steady, though it took every ounce of his strength to keep it that way. Laura walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist and leaning her head against his chest. "I missed you," she murmured. Sean's body tensed, his muscles rigid under her touch. The image of the video flashed in his mind again, her body tangled with those other men, her laughter ringing in his ears. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat and gently pulled away. "I've got some work to finish up," he said, avoiding her eyes. "I'll be in my office." Laura looked at him puzzled but didn't press. "All right," she said softly, her smile fading slightly. "I'll see you later." Sean nodded and walked back to his office, closing the door behind him. He stood there for a moment, leaning against the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what he had to do. Laura had destroyed their life, and now it was his turn to destroy hers. The next day, the house was unusually quiet when Laura pulled into the driveway. That evening, she had spent the day out with friends, shopping and sipping coffee. Her mind was far from the mounting tension she had sensed in Sean lately. As she stepped out of the car, her thoughts drifted to what they might do for dinner. Maybe they could order takeout, watch a movie, anything to shake off the strange distance she had felt growing between them. She shook off the feeling and opened the front door, humming a tune under her breath. The moment she stepped inside, she noticed the change in the atmosphere. The usual warmth that filled their home was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. Laura's humming faltered, and her eyes scanned the living room. There was Sean, sitting on the couch, his posture stiff, his eyes cold. A thick folder sat beside him on the coffee table. Her heart skipped a beat, a flash of unease flickered through her mind. Something was wrong, very wrong. "Sean," she called out softly, trying to gauge his mood. He didn't respond right away, he just sat there, staring at her with a look she had never seen before. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "We need to talk." Her stomach tightened. His voice was flat, emotionless, not like the Sean she knew. She forced a smile, trying to keep her voice light. "What's wrong?" she asked, though she already had a sinking feeling that she knew the answer. Sean leaned forward, his eyes locked onto hers with a burning intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "You know what's wrong," he said, his tone laced with a quiet fury that sent chills down her spine. "I know what you did." Laura froze. Her mind raced for a split second. She considered playing dumb, brushing it off like a misunderstanding. But as her eyes fell on the folder beside him, the weight of what was happening crashed down on her. Sean reached over, grabbed the folder, and threw it onto the table in front of her. The contents spilled out: photos, lab reports, pages of text that seemed to shout the truth she had been so desperately hiding. She stared at the pile, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands suddenly clammy. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling, despite her attempt to sound composed. Sean didn't answer, he didn't need to. Laura's eyes darted to the photos, and then she saw it, one of the photos from that night, the night she had tried so hard to forget. Her stomach twisted in knots, she felt like the room was closing in on her, the walls pressing tighter with each passing second. "Sean," she began, her voice barely more than a whisper, "it was a mistake, a mistake." Sean's voice rose, sharp and cutting. He stood up, pacing in front of her, running a hand through his hair as if trying to keep his composure. A mistake, Laura? You think sleeping with 12 different men is just a mistake? You think cheating on me, lying to my face, betraying everything we've built is a simple mistake? Laura flinched at his words, tears welling in her eyes. She had never seen him like this before. The cold, distant man standing before her was nothing like the loving, gentle husband she had known. She tried to reach for him, her voice breaking as she spoke, "Sean, please." It didn't mean anything. It was just. I don't even know what I was thinking. You wouldn't leave me, you love me too much. Her words hung in the air, a desperate plea wrapped in false confidence. She had always counted on Sean's love for her, always believed that no matter what, he wouldn't walk away. But the look in his eyes now, there was no love left, just hurt and rage. Love's Sean spat the word like it was poison. Do you even know what love is, Laura? He asked, pointing at the evidence on the table. His voice trembled with anger. What you did was the furthest thing from love. You've destroyed everything we had, everything. Laura's breath hitched, and her legs gave out beneath her. She sank to the floor, her hands shaking as the tears finally broke free. Sean, please, she sobbed, her voice raw with emotion. I'm begging you, don't leave me. We can fix this. I'll do anything, I swear, just give me another chance. She crawled towards him on her knees, reaching out as if touching him could erase the damage she had done. But Sean didn't move. He stood there, looking down at her, his face hard, his jaw clenched. There's no fixing this, Laura, he said, his voice quiet now but still carrying the weight of his finality. You've dug your own grave, and now you'll lie in it. His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She stared up at him, her face streaked with tears, her mind scrambling for something, anything, that could make him change his mind. Sean, please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I love you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sean shook his head, his expression unreadable. You're not sorry, he said coldly. You're sorry you got caught. If I hadn't found out, you'd still be out there doing God knows what with God knows who. Laura's sobs grew louder, her whole body shaking as the reality of what she had done crashed down around her. She had never truly believed it would come to this. She had always assumed Sean would forgive her, that his love for her would be enough to fix whatever damage she caused. But now, staring up at him, she realized how wrong she had been. Sean turned away from her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He couldn't look at her anymore. The sight of her on the floor, begging for forgiveness, only made him feel sicker. This was the woman he had once loved, the woman he had planned to spend the rest of his life with. But now, all he saw was a stranger who had shattered his heart. I'll be staying somewhere else tonight, he said, his voice distant. The divorce papers will be filed tomorrow. You can keep the house for now, but don't expect anything else. I'm done. Laura's cries echoed through the living room as Sean grabbed his coat and headed for the door. She tried to crawl after him, reaching out as if she could somehow stop him from leaving, but he didn't look back, not once. The door slammed shut behind him, and Laura was left alone. Her sobs were the only sound in the empty house. The evidence lay scattered on the floor, a cruel reminder of the life she had destroyed in one reckless, selfish act. And for the first time, she realized that she had lost him for good. Sean sat in his newly rented apartment, looking out at the busy street below. His mind was sharp, clear, and devoid of any emotion as he finalized the last few steps of his plan. The life he had once shared with Laura was behind him. It was time to end the last lingering connections that tethered them. He moved the cursor on his computer and transferred the remaining funds from their joint account into a new account, one only he had access to. The amount wasn't huge, but it was enough to ensure Laura would have nothing left. She had no idea yet, but she would soon. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the last few months finally starting to lift. The investigation, the evidence, the decision to walk away, it had all been a whirlwind. But now, the pieces were falling into place. The next step was the house. Sean had already contacted the realtor, the paperwork had been signed. The house would be on the market within the week. He had moved most of his personal belongings into storage, careful not to leave anything behind that could anchor him to the past. The house had been more than just a place to live, it had been a symbol of their marriage, a life he thought they'd built together. But that illusion was shattered now. It was just another asset to liquidate. Sean's phone buzzed on the table, lighting up with Laura's name. He didn't reach for it. She had been calling non-stop, growing more frantic with each unanswered message. At first, it was subtle questions about where he was and why he hadn't come home. Then came the confusion about the bank accounts. She must have noticed the missing money this morning. The panic in her voice had been clear in the last voicemail. He hit play and listened to her plead, "Sean, where are you? I went to the bank and the accounts are empty. What's happening? We need to talk. Please, just call me. This has to be some kind of mistake." Sean deleted the message. He had no intention of responding. It was too late for words now. Laura's day had started like any other. She had woken up expecting to find Sean in the kitchen or already out for work. But the house had been eerily quiet. There was no note, no text message. She brushed it off at first, thinking he was still angry after their fight. It wasn't until she checked the bank accounts that the reality of her situation hit her like a tidal wave. All of their money was gone. She drove to the bank in a panic, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. Maybe it was a technical error, or maybe Sean had moved the money to another account without telling her. But the bank manager confirmed what she feared. "Yes, Mrs. Laura, the funds were transferred by your husband yesterday. It was a joint account, so he had the right to do so." She felt the world shift beneath her feet. Everything had been swept out from under her, and she was standing on nothing. The cold realization began to sink in. Sean was gone, and he had taken everything with him. By the time she got back to the house, Laura's heart was pounding, her mind spinning with questions. Why would he do this? Was it really because of the affair? She had made mistakes, but surely they could fix this. She could explain, they could move on. She loved Sean, didn't she? He had to know that no matter what had happened. She grabbed her phone and called him again. But there was no answer. She left a message, her voice trembling as she begged him to respond, "Sean, please. I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on, but we need to talk. Please, I'm begging you, just call me." She stared at her phone, hoping for a response, but none came. She checked the time. It had been hours since she last heard from him. The silence was suffocating. Across town, Sean sipped his coffee as he watched the news scroll on his TV. He was keeping tabs on Laura, not through any desire to see her again, but to ensure his plan unfolded without any surprises. The private investigator he hired was still sending him updates, letting him know Laura was unraveling. She went to the bank that morning. The investigator had texted earlier, "Look pretty shaken." Good. Sean had made sure there was nothing left for her, no safety net, no backup. He had drained everything and left her with only her guilt and the consequences of her choices. He checked his email and saw the confirmation he'd been waiting for. The divorce papers had been filed, and Laura would be served within the next few days. He had made sure she couldn't contest it, not without the resources to hire a lawyer or mount any kind of defense. The house would be sold before she even had a chance to fight for it. Laura spent the rest of the day calling Sean. She tried his work phone, his cell phone, and even emailed him, but every message was met with silence. The house felt colder, emptier by the minute. She wandered through the rooms, her heart pounding, trying to understand what had happened. Had he left for good? Where would he have gone? In a moment of desperation, she went to their closet and saw that his clothes were missing. His side of the wardrobe was nearly empty. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. He had planned this, he had been preparing to leave her all along, and she hadn't seen it coming. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand shaking, as her phone buzzed again. She grabbed it quickly, hoping it was Sean, but it wasn't. It was the realtor. "Mrs. Laura, this is just a reminder that the house has been listed for sale. We've already had a few interested buyers, so we'll need to start scheduling viewings soon. I assume your husband has informed you of this." The blood drained from her face. The house, he was selling the house. She hung up the phone, her mind racing. She had nowhere to go, no money, no resources. Sean had made sure she was trapped, alone. She tried calling him one last time, but this time she didn't leave a message. There was no point. He had vanished, and she was left to pick up the pieces of a life that was no longer hers. Sean stood by the window of his new apartment, watching as the sun set over the city. He had blocked Louris's number hours ago. Her calls were nothing but background noise to his newfound freedom. He had erased her from his life, and now she would be left to face the consequences of her betrayal. Laura was nothing more than a ghost of the past now, and Sean, for the first time in a long time, felt a sense of peace. Months passed since Sean had severed ties with Laura, and the void left behind became a distant memory. He had settled into a new routine, finding solace in his solitude. The mornings began with coffee on the balcony, the evenings spent exploring new places and meeting new people. He felt light, free from the chains of betrayal that had weighed him down for so long. One afternoon, Sean was sitting in his favorite cafe, scrolling through his phone when a notification caught his eye. It was a news alert about local hospitals. His heart skipped a beat as he read the headline, "Local woman hospitalized after serious illness." He felt an unexpected twinge of concern and clicked the link. The article detailed how Laura had been admitted weeks ago, suffering from a severe case of a sexually transmitted disease. It painted a grim picture of her health. Her once vibrant spirit was reduced to a frail shadow. As he read on, Sean's stomach twisted. The piece revealed she had lost all her friends, and those who once adored her had vanished. They were gone, leaving her to face the consequences of her choices alone. Sean set his phone down, feeling a mix of emotions that he couldn't quite identify. Part of him felt pity for Laura, while another part relished the idea that she was finally facing the repercussions of her actions. He tried to shake off the thoughts, but they lingered as he finished his coffee and left the cafe. In the hospital, Laura lay in a sterile room, staring at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, the beeping of machines a constant reminder of her fragility. Her body was emaciated, she could barely recognize herself in the mirror. Each breath was a struggle, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional anguish gnawing at her. Days blended into one another as the isolation consumed her. Friends who once filled her life with laughter and joy had turned their backs. The men she had once laughed with and shared moments of ecstasy had abandoned her at the first sign of trouble. She felt empty, like a shell of the person she used to be. In the quiet moments, when the nurse was absent and the world outside faded, Laura found herself whispering Sean's name. "Sean, I'm so sorry." The words barely left her lips, the weight of regret heavy in the air. She wished for a chance to apologize, to tell him how wrong she had been, but the silence that followed each utterance was deafening. Back in his new life, Sean received a message from the private investigator he had hired months ago. The investigator had kept tabs on Laura's situation, but Sean had instructed him to keep his distance. He opened the message hesitantly. "Laura is in the hospital. She's very sick. Sean, you might want to consider visiting her." Sean's fingers hovered over the screen as he thought. The memories flooded back, her laughter, her smile, the love they once shared. But those moments were tainted now, marred by the betrayal he could never forgive. He shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. No, she had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. Laura's condition continued to deteriorate. The doctors explained that the disease had ravaged her body, and her immune system was failing. She was lonely, staring at the wall as days turned into a blur of medications and fatigue. Finally, she mustered the strength to ask the nurse for a phone. "Can I please call someone?" The nurse, her expression sympathetic, handed over the phone. "Who would you like to call?" "Sean." The nurse hesitated but nodded, dialing the number. Laura's heart raced as the phone rang. When Sean answered, there was a pause. "Hello," he said, his voice steady. "Sean, it's me," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "Laura." His tone was flat, devoid of any emotion. "I need you. I'm so sorry for everything. Please, I can't do this alone. I'm begging you, just come and see me." Sean felt a cold emptiness wash over him. "You made your choice, Laura. You left me no option." "But Sean, I'm sick. I'm scared," the words hung in the air. "You brought this on yourself, you need to accept that." Laura's heart sank. She could hear the finality in his voice. "I thought you loved me," she said. "I did, but that love is gone," he replied. The call ended. Days later, Sean received another text from the investigator, this time accompanied by a link to an article, "Laura's condition worsens, friends remain absent." The article detailed her struggles in the hospital, the lack of visitors, and her deteriorating health. Sean read it with a sense of detachment, but it stirred something in him. A faint whisper of empathy echoed in his mind, as he recalled the moments they had shared, the joy, the laughter, the intimacy. But those memories were overshadowed by the betrayal that had ripped their lives apart. As the days turned to weeks, Laura continued to fight, but it was a losing battle. She lay in bed, waiting for a visitor who never came, staring at the clock as it ticked away the moments of her life. Each tick felt like a reminder of her failures. She remembered the nights she had spent in Sean's arms, the dreams they had built together, and the warmth of his love. But all that warmth had turned to ice, and she was left with nothing. One evening, after the last of her strength had faded, Laura called for the nurse. "Can you help me call him one last time?" she asked. The nurse nodded, sympathetic yet cautious. "Of course, Laura, but he may not come." "I just want to apologize," she whispered. The nurse dialed the number again, and after a few rings, Sean picked up. I'm sorry. I wish things were different. I wish I could take it all back. Why should I care now?" "Because I'm dying, Sean," she added, her voice trembling. There was a long pause. "I'm sorry to hear that," he finally said, his voice steady. "I can't face this alone. Please, just come." But Sean had made his decision long ago. "I can't help you anymore. You did this to yourself." Laura's heart shattered as the reality hit her harder than any physical pain. "Please, Sean, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." But all she heard was silence on the other end of the line. As days passed, Laura's body continued to fail her, alone in her hospital room. She succumbed to the disease that had ravaged her body, her last thoughts of Sean, the man she had once loved fiercely, now a ghost in her memory. Meanwhile, Sean thrived, filling his life with new experiences and new relationships, never looking back. Each day was a step further from the pain Laura had caused him. He found peace in his solitude, leaving behind the echoes of regret that lingered in Laura's last moments. In the end, Laura died alone, a broken woman filled with regret. Sean lived the life she could only dream of, happy, fulfilled, and at peace, while she faded into the forgotten past. He moved forward, free from the weight of their shattered dreams.